We now turn to the topic of the main steps involved in conducting the barrier analysis. And I will in this presentation go through the following steps to clarify this process. I'll start by explaining in short how to organize the process. After this, I'll look more into the screening of the barriers. After this, I'll explain what we mean by a listing of all of the identified barriers. And we then turn to the selection of the most essential of the identified barriers. And finally, I'll explain what we mean by the decomposition of the selected essential barriers. So how to organize the process? In the case of the barrier analysis, this generally follows the setup in the TNA, where the national consultants are involved as facilitators of the process. But in this case, there might be an opportunity for seeking closer cooperation with the sectoral working groups, and maybe also to form technology-specific working groups in order to obtain a detailed understanding of the particular technology in question. We generally recommend some form of stakeholder consultation in order to conduct the barrier analysis. This may be done through workshops or written feedback or bilateral communication, which again should follow the national priorities and context in question. So turning now to the broad screening of the barriers, we start by asking the overall question of what is currently preventing the wide-scale diffusion of a given technology. And the idea here is to start by what you may call a broad review-based desk study, looking at the previous available policy papers, regulation, consultant reports, industry reports, to look at what's actually currently available in the country. And this should be supplemented by additional interviews, bilateral meetings, different types of stakeholder consultation, in order to obtain a deeper understanding of the particular technology in question. So after this, the result of this exercise of having done the broad review-based desk study, you may find a situation where a lot of different types of barriers have been identified. This can either be in the form of those that are financial, economic in nature, maybe related to the cost of capital, or the technology might be considered risky. You can also imagine a situation where the barriers mentioned in the reports and the stakeholder consultations have pointed at the market conditions. It may be so that there are few national suppliers. The market may be dominated by incumbents and so forth. In terms of regulation, there might be problems related to over-bureaucratic procedures, corruption, and so forth. And similar, there may be barriers in terms of information. There may be a limited awareness of the technology, mission feedback links, and so forth. And finally, reports and consultants' papers may have addressed the case of technology barriers. There may be few local references, projects, and so forth. So the result of the overview of barriers may look something similar to a listing of all of the identified barriers. So the next step involves a selection of those barriers that are the most essential ones. So going from the longer list of the barriers identified, the idea is then to point out the most important barriers that are currently preventing large-scale diffusion of a technology. And one way to do this is to look at the barriers in terms of those that are non-starters, to those that are crucial, and then moving on to those that are less important or maybe even insignificant. And the idea is then to delete those barriers that are not essential. So this should aim at prioritizing and ranking the most important barriers in hierarchical order. And in workshops, this may be done either by agreement by consensus or majority vote, for example, where workshop participants are asked to rank barriers on a scale from 1 to 5, for example. And the results may then be listed according to the sum of scores. And you can imagine a situation then where the bottom third is deleted, for example. So this is one way of doing this exercise, to getting a closer and more detailed understanding of the most essential barriers. To give an example of how this process may look, we have the relative importance of the barrier. And the understanding may be that one of the most important barriers may be inadequate access to financial resources. Also of high importance may be the high cost of capital, and so forth, whether there is an insufficient institutional framework, capacity in the government agency, energy needs of the rural population may not be addressed. There may be insufficient skilled manpower, and there may be disincentives for foreign investment. So these are the most essential barriers in this example. So the idea is then to select, let's say, the top 5 or the top 6 of these barriers that are the most important. And these barriers should then be taken along for the next step in the barrier analysis. The next and the final step then would be to focus specifically on one of these top 5 or top 6 barriers, and then reach an even further and more detailed understanding of these barriers. So taking the example, for example, of the high cost of capital as we saw before, the idea is to go further into looking at, well, what is actually involved in this particular type of barrier? Is it related to the high interest rate, for example? Or can we further disaggregate this particular barrier into the question of that there may be only short-term loans available in this particular context? And then the next step would again be to further decompose these particular types of barriers. It may be related to that the interest rate is in this case too high for households. And you could imagine a situation where we can even disaggregate these barriers into further subcomponents. And so the idea here is to do this exercise for all of the most essential barriers identified in order to reach an even more detailed understanding of what is actually the nature of these barriers. And that concludes the process of how to organize and identify barriers.